Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to Wojciech Przybylski in Warsaw. I'm glad to see you that you joined today, our first event in the series. I will just briefly introduce the program instead of speaking about other issues that I wanted to talk before, like the Eastern Partnership policy beyond 2020, reinforcing resilience, joint communication, and so forth. Because one of the guests could join us for 1 hour, and I would like you to participate in the discussion as well. So I'll just make a short introduction. So we plan 20 events altogether, covering 5 topics. So beginning with the Central European countries' policies, particularly regarding the Eastern Partnership, then civilian security sector reform, healthcare reform and social policy, renewable energy sector development, and IT sector governance and information society development. And on each topic, we will have discussions with prominent experts from Visegrad 4 countries, and also some discussions with Armenian policymakers and experts, and also our Center for Policy Studies plans to publish a paper with policy recommendations on each of the topics. So today I'm glad to welcome as our first presenter the editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight magazine, Wojciech Przybylski, a very well-informed expert. And Visegrad Insight is one of the publications in English that you should follow EU-related issues in general, and also Central European countries, politics, German politics, Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. A lot of issues and a lot of aspects covered. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting presentation by Wojciech. And I would like to ask all the participants to have the microphones muted unless it's time to ask questions. And in the meantime, it's possible to ask questions via chat. And so if you get a question and you want to remember some things, you may already write in chat about that. And afterwards, I'm going to first read those questions probably, and then we will also have time for additional rounds of questions. So please welcome Mr. Wojciech Przybylski. The floor is yours, Wojciech.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. So good morning for Warsaw. Very glad to be talking today. And as Armen requested, I'll be speaking mostly on the Eastern Partnership perspective of Poland, but also I'll present a report, the report that we published as Visegrad Insight. And the report was developed in cooperation with some 30 experts from the region of Eastern Partnership and Central Europe. It is the Eastern European Futures. It's a special edition also of Visegrad Insight magazine, online magazine. But paper copies are also available. If you were interested, just contact me later on. The report itself has been developed and co-developed really with the German Marshall Fund. It's our second cooperation like that on building up scenarios for regions of Europe. And one of the regions, the first region was Central Europe, the trajectories, political trajectories of Central Europe. Now I'll speak briefly about the report and the scenarios and the work, how it emerged. And in the second part of what I have to say, I will focus on Poland's perspective, which is of key interest, I understand, from Armen, and we can discuss. Now, I will repeat what Armen said. Anyone who has a mic on, that it would be very good not to have one, because I heard the background noise, but now it's so perfect. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well, and I'll try to be clear, but chat, signal me on chat if I need to repeat anything. Sometimes I also have internet lags and it doesn't work so perfectly. So as I mentioned, the report, I'll start and I'll begin right after. I'm sure in this group, perfectly well that the Eastern Partnership is entering its second decade as a policy framework of the European Union. And exactly because there were some accomplishments and also some, basically there was a benchmark against which European policy framework was evaluated for the policy goals for 2020. We decided to start to think about what are the scenarios to help design policies that will address Eastern Partnership in all its diversity and differentiation between the countries, but also overall as a frame of reference, because EU policies towards Eastern Partnership are shaped as towards a region with this a certain degree, of course, of flexibility. So as I mentioned, the report was published actually this year in March 2020. It was preceded by intensive work on workshops and trends. There is actually a separate publication on trends of Eastern Partnership, as we have identified them, with a lot of data showing many similarities despite policy or strategic direction differences. There are many similarities in the processes on economy, on demography between most of the countries of Eastern Partnership. Also security dilemmas are similar, but also geographically they vary. One of the most striking for me was that except for Azerbaijan, most of the countries of Eastern Partnership are facing two dilemmas related to the European Union. One is the rapid depopulation or aging of societies, but also connected to mass movements of people. There is a negative impact in a way on the population. I don't say it's not normative. I'm not saying this is bad or good or bad, but in terms of numbers, this is less people staying in countries of Eastern Partnership. Many have moved, and over the years, you can see the trend. Many are still moving to the other countries of the European Union. On the positive side, on the added value when it comes to this engagement and the relationship between the European Union as an economic space, the countries of Eastern Partnership demonstrate that the most of the economic benefits or exchange and benefits from that are with the European Union. They are only increasing, and with a striking number and very, very important number on ICT, digital. And again, with the exception of Azerbaijan, all countries, and I think on top there is Moldova, if I remember correctly, let me check, yes, have been increasing in the portfolio of exports of services in this economic exchange with the European Union. Again, the volume of this exchange being the highest of all other partners, global partners, have been showing that ICT and digital is not only growing, but I mean, it's not only relatively high, already at 10% in some cases, but it's also dynamically growing. So it also kind of shows that the framework of Eastern Partnership is bringing some economic deliverables. But the countries of the region are, of course, seen differently, varying on the geographical location, also because of their relationship to Russia and the security dilemmas related to that. In frozen conflicts, real war in Ukraine are of a real issue for every of these countries, even recently including Belarus, and security threats and the possibility of ensuing hybrid warfare is actually something that we're seeing ahead of the presidential election. We have seen that ahead of the presidential election, but it's also going on, and it is likely to continue as a struggle between the two countries is going to continue, especially the leadership of the two countries, I mean, Lukashenko and Mr. Putin. There are many other processes, and because of the attachment to the European Union, you see that the more the interaction between the Eastern Partnership countries with the European Union go, the more influential policies that are drawn in the EU are the more impact those policies have on the countries of Eastern Partnership. And here it's noteworthy to mention, it's noteworthy that it's a Green Deal, so-called Green Deal, climate and environmental policies that are in large extent impactful on how the future, the shape of Eastern Partnership energy and environmental policy sector will look like. You can see a lot of that also when it comes to information and digital, the policies that currently are drafted in the European Union regarding social media, e-governance, transparency, many other are likely to be very influential for the state of affairs in the countries of Eastern Partnership. But that said, of course, there is no immediate implementation of those, and we have to see that interrelation always with individual perspective on a particular country. We have also seen over the years, and I'm sure you are aware of that, that 3 of the 6 countries show more ambition, and those ambitions to integrate faster economically and aim for maybe even more than political association over the time. These are growing. These are growing now, especially when it comes to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. With some progress with Armenia, some restart of talks with Azerbaijan, as recently communicated, and an option to work to rework restart some negotiation with Belarus. Now, the situation now in 2010 seems to be completely, 2020, that seems to be completely different from, of course, 2010. And if you look back at the last 10 years, a lot have been changed, and I think a lot has been achieved, but not to say that to any, neither the countries of Eastern Partnership nor the European Union, this is a satisfactory result currently. And there are some bumps and pitfalls ahead of us. In our report with 4 scenarios, we're looking at different trends, not only Eastern Partnership trends, but trends, global trends that are observable around the world. And we try to see, to zoom in on Eastern Partnership countries and check which of the global trends that we see, which is, for instance, resilience, nationalism, the end of a certain economic model, changes in economic trade, the new tensions between US and China, but also tensions between Russia and the West overall. Those global processes, how impactful and how important they are in the Eastern Partnership countries. And we also try to see what sort of new trajectories or even old trajectories that might resurface when we think through those trends in sort of ideal type. So I'm gonna go through these 4 scenarios and then focus on the perspective on Poland. First scenario of the 4 is what we call pragmatic integration. And what it seems to be today is a scenario that is unfolding as we speak. So there is little appetite for anything more than economic integration and political association implementation of the of legislation that is necessary, that is required to open up borders. There's a better element of conditionality, of course, for the countries of Eastern Partnership to move more freely, to open up to new possibilities that the European Union offers. It's driven by the economic integration and the economic benefits, hence we call it pragmatic integration. And it is a transformative process, no doubt. This is sort of a zero-based scenario, so no major processes will influence in this scenario the path on which and the trajectories on which the countries of Eastern Partnership are today, or nothing major would change the approach of the European Union over the next 10 years. It's hard to believe because we're living in turbulent times, but yet maybe because of that, we need to assume a zero-base scenario, so to say, zero change or minimal change scenario. That doesn't mean that things will not change within the countries of Eastern Partnership. If we think through it, and if we look through this scenario and narrate it, if you can read, it's not a long one. Each of the scenarios maybe 2 pages long altogether, if you can find it on our website. And as I mentioned, I'm happy to send a copy to you if someone is interested. At the end of this process, imagine next 10 years, with the goals and the processes set in motion as they are now, you're likely to see that at different speeds, at different ambitions at which several countries are moving on those trajectories towards the goals of Eastern Partnership framework, are putting the whole framework in jeopardy, so to say. It's not a big jeopardy. Eastern Partnership framework is nothing of something worth dying for, and fighting for altogether. But it's a framework designed as a package for all 6 countries. And in the first scenario that I'm talking about, you can imagine that in 10 years' time, there will be some countries that will still fit into the framework. And there will be some countries that will demand more, and they will actually change. Some people may say upgrade or graduate from this format into something new that is not yet designed. And that will put in sort of a jeopardy the whole framework that will be leaving behind some of the countries. And I'm speaking mostly by Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, that show ambition. They demonstrate progress at different levels, and we can discuss specifics, and there are many troubles to be overcome, internal troubles, domestic policy included. But overall, you can see that they're moving on faster than other countries, Azerbaijan, Belarus, for that matter, being on the opposite side of such a scale. So at the end of the scenario, we see, well, if not the end of the framework, in 10 years' time, there might not be Eastern Partnership anymore, or a severely limited Eastern Partnership, sort of a loser's club. So change of the format of Eastern Partnership into something else, not of a format that we know today, but much more of some sort of appeasing the relationship, difficult relationship with countries that are still stuck somewhere in between, middle way, and do not know where to move. While the others are joining all the designed areas of integration of Europe. Doesn't mean they become members, not at all, but they are definitely somewhere at a different place, and that helps them move on. And new policy framework for them specifically, or overall for the neighborhood of EU, might be designed at that point. Fine. So scenario number 2. Scenario number 2 is we call it Russian hegemony revisited, and the title should speak for itself. It is a situation in which, with little protest or little influence on Russia from European Union or the West overall, you would see another intervention from Kremlin into one of the countries of Eastern Partnership. I mentioned earlier Belarus. It is a likely scenario that there will be some sort of intervention, and there were attempts already to influence Belarus in all possible ways. Doesn't have to be a military conflict, but it might be a security threat scenario. It might be energy-related scenario, or it might be a scenario where this hybrid, mostly information tactics, leads to takeover of key assets in the country and make a puppet out of Lukashenko as a president of Belarus. And that situation, that another, but it might be not Belarus. I mean, imagine that happens in any other country. Again, a situation like this, without stronger reaction of the EU, would have a chilling effect, we believe, on many countries of Eastern Partnership. Perhaps not those which are undergoing a hot war, but several others, like Moldova, might think twice before they actually commit more and stay on the path they're currently on. And that scenario, of course, assumes the European Union does not have a strong voice, united voice. Even last time, it was in many ways played by the Russian side when the Russians requested France and Germany, rather the whole EU to be approached by the whole EU on the question of Ukraine. In such a scenario, EU is also less interested, or I wouldn't say less interested, but less able and less focused on those dilemmas. As we already know today, there is an economic crisis ensued, and such moments and such situations are unfortunately happening, and they're exploited by players willing to use force and willing to apply this strange notion of geopolitics into practice, especially in times of economic crisis. If we think back 2008, regardless of all other circumstances, this was precisely the moment the world was struck by a severe economic crisis, and there was a country willing to apply force and willing to advance its ideology of geopolitics, especially because of the weakened state of international world order during economic crisis. So that scenario, of course, leaves Eastern Partnership a bit frozen, less ambitious, and even increases the chances that only several countries will push forward, but perhaps not even with so much success as in the scenario number one. Then the third scenario, these scenarios, by the way, if you have noticed, might not be all good news. We have designed them. There is a degree of pessimism, but these scenarios are not fatalistic. They do not have to happen. I have to stress that these are rather scenarios that should help us think how we are able to contain the processes that we are talking about. How should we react in order to prevent or remain resilient when a situation like this is unfolding? So the first scenario, now moving to this one, is called EU pivot to Moscow. And again, relationship between EU and Moscow seem to be of key importance here, and the importance of this relationship might manifest itself as it did in the 90s, when there was a risk of turmoil in Russia because of economic downfall, because of problems with managing multiple crises that included security dilemmas, still Red Army and nuclear proliferation. And all of that was leading many Europeans, not naively, but out of the experience, historical experience, to sort of embrace Russia and to deal with Russia. Of course, it didn't happen well, but perhaps the appetites are still there to try this direction in times, especially in times when all of the world is hit hard by economic crisis. And again, we drafted this scenario well in advance. Now we can consider how much of the COVID situation and economic crisis that impacts everyone around will change priorities and will change the strategic thinking on options and possibilities vis-a-vis Russia. And the option here, although there are some news, for instance, recently from, I think today from France, that France signaled it is actually disappointed with progress with Russia relations, and the direction they chose might not be there. The best to pursue. There are still appetites within the countries of European Union to set a new norm, new normal, hit a reset button with relations with Russia. Consider a situation which is an economic situation, economic crisis, in which European Union might follow such a thinking. Most of the bulk of the countries might follow such a thinking. That would lead essentially not necessarily to dismantling the framework of Eastern Partnership, but in order of priority, it would push down the questions of integrating countries of Eastern Partnership economically, or moving them, in terms of policy forward toward the better standards of good governance. And especially if Russia would not approve of so much of European Union activity in that area. And it was formally or informally signaling that European leaders. Also, the design of thinking in this direction already implies that it's one or another for those who would pursue such an objective. Of course, I'm not speaking of current leaders, essentially of current leaders of the European Union member states, but there are many. You can talk in the European Parliament, in different opposition groups within countries of the European Union. There are many who might be in charge within the next 10 years and who may push forward this direction in order to set the relationship between EU and Russia, and renew them and set them on a course that would also help economically troubled continent. In that perspective, as I mentioned, the countries of Eastern Partnership might feel that they're not cheated there, but they are kind of less important. They much more focus on their domestic agenda. They would much more look inside of what's going on and what they can do, perhaps together. That would be a positive news, a positive impulse of how to build in their internal resilience. But that might be not happening as well. That scenario also assumes that in the course of such a reset with Russia, new relationship with Russia from the EU, many of the more ambitious projects and hopes for the countries of Eastern Partnership would be overshadowed and would not see that they are prioritized enough during EU presidencies. So the political strategies of the countries of European Union would not embrace that. And then the fourth scenario. And the fourth scenario is a little bit different. We call it civic emancipation. Civic emancipation is a scenario that, not to say disregards all the external factors. As you have seen, I focused a lot in the report, in presentation of the report, on the external factors. And indeed, the report highlights mostly EU and Russia and Eastern Partnership in that context, but also it highlights China, Iran, and Turkey when it comes to the influence on the politics, on the foreign policy and politics of those countries. But the fourth scenario, it looks from a completely different angle. It looks from an angle of civic emancipation. So very much from what is going on in the hearts and minds of the people, of the peoples of Eastern Partnership, in civil society, in how their agency is being built up, be it through protests, but also be it through increased number of cooperations and ways of cooperation, also because of new technologies. Sometimes this empowerment of civil society comes when there are these small and rare windows of opportunities to cooperate with more of autocratic power. Like in Belarus, we have seen a bulk of a digital sector securing a lot of its own liberty for the sake of developing their IT business sector in Belarus. which was approved and which was seen as a positive input to the economy by Lukashenko. But at the same time, it was spreading this bubble, of course, in a limited circle, but still better something than zero in a country where in similar to that process or in parallel to that process, you see much more of civic engagement, activity in the streets, activity in the civil society. And that civic emancipation is leading to building up agency of the society in shaping the democratic future. That is looking at several policies that are being implemented, the policies also of e-governance, for instance, where the civil society is usually sensitive these days, especially to the questions of surveillance, infringement of privacy, and setting other examples as better standards. They're moves that push for reform and push for change within the country, regardless of external influence. So this scenario assumes and shows that at the end of the day, the countries of Eastern Partnership are becoming more democratic, good news, regardless of the process and progress with the European Union itself. Scenarios then were developed and presented later along with policy recommendations at many other events, but we haven't been talking in the context of Armenia yet, so I'm happy to discuss them further. But here I will also stop presenting scenarios and let me just turn to the question at hand that Armen was asking me. And namely, this question is about Poland's foreign policy and Poland's approach to Eastern Partnership. Well, as you know, Eastern Partnership has been initiated. It was an initiative, a joint initiative by Poland and Sweden. Quickly, Czech Republic and all of the Visegrad group countries jumped on board. They saw an opportunity in this in various aspects, Visegrad group being one of the key foreign policy instruments for Poland. It was important continuation and institutionalization of the Eastern Partnership. But most importantly, and the biggest achievement and the long-standing achievement is that it's no longer, Eastern Partnership is no longer a Polish policy. Eastern Partnership is no longer a policy of the Visegrad group. It is a European Union policy framework. So this is designed and agreed and backed up by all of the member states of the European Union. It is truly a European Union policy. So Poland's, of course, is proud and is sort of in a way triumphant about the policy it helped to design and implement on the EU level. Sometimes it doesn't use it well, especially that the recent political change brought a lot of polarization. So the positive effects of the past years are often downplayed by the new government. But overall, Eastern Partnership is in all of the priorities of foreign policy. They are in the official communication and priorities of the foreign minister, in the support for Eastern Partnership, however, with a narrowed angle, is in the country's national security strategy designed by the Office of the National Security next to the President, to the Office of the President of Poland. And you can see a lot of involvement, diplomatic, public diplomacy involvement on behalf of Poland when it comes either to civil society projects and supporting Eastern Partnership as a general direction in the efforts of civil society in the form of grants and it be democracy assistance or development assistance issued by the Polish from the Polish budget. And also what you can see is that the Eastern Partnership with much of support from Poland has been for a long time and continues to be one of the priorities of the Visegrad Fund, the Visegrad Group Cooperation, and it's an instrument, which is Visegrad Fund, that helps to develop and integrate cooperation between four countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Polish-specific angle on Eastern Partnership, I would say, has three important dimensions. First, it's a dimension connected to who we are as Poland. It's a question of identity, and it's a question of how it is often called in Poland, Polska polityka wschodnia, the Polish Eastern policy. Polish Eastern policy of Poland very often doesn't have much to do with actual policies and relationship to the countries of Eastern Partnership. It's very much inward-looking perspective of Poland seeing and designing itself as a country to the east on the map of Europe, and looking and being aware and presently aware of all the processes taking place in the east. And indeed, I mean, we have fantastic institutions that are dealing with those subjects, like the Center for Eastern Studies, OSW. There are many experts that relate to there. There are many independent ones, like New Eastern Europe, Nowa Europa Wschodnia Kolegium Jana Nowaka-Jeziorańskiego, that within Poland, sometimes with state support, but overall more broadly as a deeper strategic thinking, embrace the thinking about the East as the key policy area of Poland. So that's one of these elements. Second more, I would say, more pragmatic element is an element in which Poland is starting to recognize and prioritize in the security dimension the countries where progress is being achieved. And for that, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are enumerated in the security strategy of Poland as the only countries of Eastern Partnership. Eastern Partnership is actually not even mentioned in the updated security strategy as a format related to EU or NATO. But these three countries are mentioned as one of the several priorities of Poland's security. And that security and that thinking about security dimension of Eastern Partnership very much relates to intellectual continuity we have seen throughout 20th century, even before the Second World War, where Poland was quick to recognize the independence and support the independence of republics that used to compose in 16th century, 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the unique project, political project then. And instead of nurturing nostalgia and resentments about the lost big territories and cultural heritage, the thinking came that the best companion against revisionist and imperialist Russian ambitions, then transformed into USSR, were independent agents, independent sovereign states to the east of Poland. This thinking finds itself a continuation, and whenever you see ambitions, agency within the countries of Eastern Partnership in that respect, but this thinking has broader scale than just Eastern Partnership, Poland is willing and vocal to support them in any way it can, in any way it is invited to, also in the respect and respecting the independence and sovereignty of the direction these countries want to take. The overall strategic goals goes well beyond contemporary political alliances with particular political directions, elected officials, or leaders of those countries. So again, I would say there is a deep strategic thinking in that that is carrying not so much for those countries, but for Polish security in the East. And the third one I will mention, it's a completely technical level, because the ideas Poland might have and does have about how to cooperate with countries of Eastern Partnership, that would in any way differ from, or wouldn't even say differ, that would bring added value in comparison to what the EU framework is offering, are not really there. So what Poland is trying to do, because EU package and framework rather than package is so much all-encompassing, is to go exactly where things might be underdeveloped. And that you can see with a lot of effort in supporting continuous support of the civil society initiative, people contacts, but also think tanks, analytical expert groups, and also search for ideas that would translate the experiences of Poland, like building up local decentralized administration, so municipal democracy and municipal level of, subsidiary level of state administration, and translated and promoted in the countries of Eastern Partnership. You can see that engagement in Ukraine. You could have seen that engagement in other parts of countries of Eastern Partnership wherever it made sense. And that is an effort of Poland to have some sort of a democracy-related Eastern looking, but now also experimented with the Western Balkans, by the way, a format of a tool really of foreign policy that brings some added value on top of what Eastern Partnership already offers. I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to, just exactly 45 minutes. So Armen, over to you for any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. May I just ask you perhaps to share the link to the report in the group chat?
Sure.
So the participants would see it. And we got some questions. First, Dr. Stefan Meister, who joined us from Tbilisi. I would ask him to ask the questions now. Please, Stefan.
Hi, Wojciech. Nice to see you. I'm now heading the South Caucasus Office Heinrich Böll Foundation, so I need a Berlin break because of different reasons. Yeah, I think you might also know it. So I use this opportunity, this invitation, also from our end to join this discussion. Thank you very much. I think I like the publication really very much. It's really interesting. I just have two or three questions. I try to stick to be as short as possible. Just a footnote, because I completely agree with you with the Polish strategic goals in its foreign policy. But at the same time, I think we have at the moment a government which has no foreign policy, which has mainly a domestic policy in many fields. And Poland has lost its role also in the EU, which it had when it initiated the Eastern Partnership with Sweden together as a lawyer of these countries. And I think also from a German perspective, this is really a big deficit, yeah, for the EU to have Poland here not anymore in this field. Just to my questions, I'm short. I have to ask on Armenia, yeah, because where do you see Armenia in your scenario? I think you have to say something about it with a country which is part of the Eurasian Economic Union and has this special agreement with the EU. So is also discussed as a test case. I'm always a skeptic of this kind of test case arguments, but it is somehow in between and has this pro-democratic government. So where do you see Armenia here in this field? Maybe a second question on this Green Deal, because I think this is very important. We had this discussion about update or upgrade, and now we have an update. Yeah, let's say it like this: there is no upgrade within the Eastern Partnership, and I think it is crucial that Eastern Partnership countries will be part of the Green Deal. Yeah, because this is the main driver of EU's policy within the next 5 years. If you are not part of the Green Deal, you will not get much money and not much support. So for me, the question is, how much are, from your perspective, these countries are prepared to be part of the Green Deal, and how much the EU is prepared also to add them to the Green Deal? And I mean, I don't know if I can ask, maybe that's enough, or I have one additional question, but maybe I stick to this too, or what do you say?
Yeah, well, please go on.
Okay, thank you. Because this is my topic also, I want to ask also about Russia. I don't ask about China. I think this is another issue which should also be discussed, but I want to ask when you develop the scenarios, maybe I haven't heard it, but is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? So for which period you develop these 10 years? Okay, because from my perspective, Russia in this discussion, in this region, it's difficult to discuss it, but Russia is a declining power. If you ask economists, it has like 8 to 10 years with its oil and gas resources, and then it's really getting problematic. And this time there will be enough resources. And for me, the question is this, I think we are all not prepared for Russia as a declining power. Yeah, also neither Germany nor the EU is prepared for it. And I think it will become more aggressive also. The weaker it becomes, the more aggressive it will be. Yeah, this is the logic for me behind it. But Russia is also a stabilizer for this region. Yeah, it's labor migration going to Russia, which is very important. It has some negative, but also some stabilizing security role in the region. So looking to a more complex picture of Russia, I just want to challenge this also a little bit. I think it's also, if Russia becomes weaker, it will be also destabilizing for the region, and Russia will maybe not the only dominator. Yeah, so I see China here. I might see Turkey also in some parts, but let's see how Turkey develops and maybe others. So are we not focused too much on Russia in some ways sometimes, and see not others are also emerging here, and maybe discussing Russia also as too strong? Which is also a narrative Russia promotes in its own propaganda quite successfully. So I just stop here. So sorry for so many questions.
Yeah, great questions. Armen, can I just go on? Yeah. I'm not fully equipped to discuss Green Deal in detail and the impact on countries, but in partnership, but definitely there is a lot. Where do I begin? Yeah, let's go into the Armenia, the case of you ask specific questions about Armenia, how Armenia would find itself in those in these perspectives. Yeah, and given in the recent political leadership, there are some hopes that Armenia actually now is going much more forward in the implementation of Eastern Partnership. But there is a lot of wait and see attitude currently. Also because I mean that's something that needs to be confirmed. And usually, how you confirm any trend, political trend, is after you have another election cycle. So for that, of course, there is a rare window of opportunity, but there are many windows of opportunities that European Union or Poland specifically were jumping into, and then it turned out that these were lost battles, and maybe I don't need to enumerate those within the Eastern Partnership, but you see that sometimes this effort has not been rewarded to the extent it has in the past. Armenia is definitely seen in our scenarios as with a lot of legacy of the past years. So we did not account for as much of the recent changes. I mean, all support. I think our mindsets are all in support of the recent change for democratic empowerment within the country and more agency of its own. But everybody realized the kind of the thinking, the patterns of thinking about security related to Nagorno-Karabakh, related to this special relationship with Russia that Armenia sees also as a security or stability guarantor for its position in the region, and so the hopes that this new direction for Armenia are not so high. But not to say they're low. It's more of a wait and see attitude, specifically seen from Poland, I think. Armenia is also not a big priority now in the eyes of Poland. Speaking of Poland, I must, of course, relate to what you said at the very beginning. Indeed, there is an issue with foreign policy of Poland not being influential so much in the European Union. I actually lament very much that, but you cannot always have everything, right? That the portfolio of EU enlargement went to Hungarians, having completely different mindset. Yes, there is some sort of an influence on Hungarians, but Hungarians are really not interested in Eastern Partnership. Let's see what they deliver, in the sense of Mr. Varhey being close, basically being a proxy of Mr. Orban. However, commissioners should not be dependent on the country or any political agent. This individual commissioner is seen as very much dependent on, very much aligned with Viktor Orban policy, and the understanding is that the priority there is not on Eastern Partnership but on Western Balkans for them, specifically for Hungarian foreign policy, and this is the area they will look into. But we have to appreciate, we have to see how much this commissioner, Mr. Varhey, was invested of time and meeting support for the Eastern Partnership already when he was in office. But having said that, Poland and Hungary are not the best, currently are not the best, so to say, the
role models.
Lobbyists. No, I wanted to say more pragmatically, lobbyists for anything in the EU. The relative influence on foreign policy has been reduced to saying no instead of saying something positive. Some people say, of course, that saying no is already very influential, but it's a no is a stop. It's a no-go, and you don't produce any significant change in the policy. Rather you block. It's a blocking power, and usually this blocking comes for various different reasons, not the reasons that are actually there that in respect to the particular policy. Take an example of migration policy. Migration policy serves as a perfect key for any other negotiation that Hungary was willing to undertake, at least in the eyes of Hungarians. So similarly to that, Polish position in the EU has been limited. Simply speaking, the initiatives of Eastern Partnership could have been much more visible, much more ambitious. Having said that, let me also relate to one other idea that Poland was proposing under this very government, the idea to help the countries of Eastern Partnership, encourage them to integrate between themselves much more, sort of copy-pasting this model of Central European kindergarten that we used to be as Visegrad Group before joining the EU. So in a way to design and develop policies, but also a culture of cooperation before any prospects of further integration with the European Union, which would involve, for instance, one common delegate, one person going, one country representing, presiding Eastern Partnership. Interesting ideas. They, regardless of what you think about how, what they are in practice, how practical or implementable they are, these ideas would fly much higher and would be much more stronger if Poland was in some different place when it comes to its own problems, rule of law, and the conflict with the EU. Second point, Green Deal. As I mentioned, I'm not really so well equipped. My other colleagues are much more. My understanding is that the Green Deal policies, whenever it comes to agriculture, whenever it comes to this kind of not even the key elements of energy sector that needs and is in great need and is actually one of the big points for Eastern Partnership to modernize, to change, not to follow the steps of Poland in that respect, because Poland has been delaying much of its modernization over the last years, and now it finds itself with enormous burdens ahead of us because of what needs to be done in an energy sector. Energy sector is definitely something somehow easier for other countries of Eastern Partnership, also partly because there is a nuclear energy. Someone coming from Bell Foundation wouldn't perhaps like it so much, but there is green energy transformation much more possible when you have nuclear than when you don't have nuclear, and you have to rely on in this process in the meantime, or either other suppliers or other sources of energy. Might be a matter of perception much more from decision makers, but this perception is actually shaping energy security policies of the countries that are speaking. But I think much more, no less important are all the policies, all the little small policies that you have to understand are going horizontal. For instance, the policies related to circular economy. I mean, country like Armenia, I've visited only once in my lifetime, hope to visit it as soon as I can again, is facing a lot of problem with waste, a lot of waste with microplastics, you know, this foil bags scattered around the whole country. I mean, there are policies now that are going to influence enormously how products are going to be distributed and then picked up and recycled. And all of this is just an example that in areas even like packaging, the Green Deal will be impactful, very impactful. It will push businesses, big businesses mostly, to implement higher standards of packaging, implying higher costs. And those big businesses will definitely fight for all the micro scale to be implementing same regulation unless they want to be challenged by some underdogs. So this type of thinking, this overall strategy of Green Deal will be all-encompassing change, even for countries that are not implementing anything in particular currently, but because of the impact on business or because of the impact on agriculture and possibilities of exporting, they will have tremendous transformative power on the countries of Eastern Partnership. I stop here because, again, we're actually getting there more. We're reading much more on and preparing more analysis now on green, but I wouldn't say I can say much more. In the context of Eastern Partnership, we've been focusing on green in Green Deal and environment now for Central Europe much more. But having said that, in the report there's much more, and there is also another report. We published earlier on EaP trends, also EaP 2030 trends, as part of this project, but published earlier, as I mentioned, just as a preparatory material. And I'll also send you a link here. There you go. And Russia, your last question, Stefan, we did assume, even in the scenarios, it is a declining power. No, it might be used, usually it's a Polish perception that, you know, declining or not, Russia is dangerous. I think that was actually the second part of your question. Because of turbulent time in Russia, Russia has been often showing that is in order to focus attention elsewhere or to keep integrity of the structures of power, it is willing to invest in foreign conflicts. And it is indeed dangerous time. This is why we are looking at, for instance, the scenario number 2, Russia hegemony revisited, in a particular circumstance, because also we come to this realization that Russia might be doing the usual only if it's allowed to, only if it sees there's an opportunity from other players that Russia, I mean in Polish language, Russia is a she would remain unchecked. I don't think currently there is this situation, but nevertheless we outlined scenario what might happen if there was some sort of appeasement again, a reset button appetite within the countries of Eastern Europe, European Union, and that's how the scenarios were developed. But also I have to underline here that we usually connect the resources and the power of influence of Russia with specifically energy sector. So from oil then to pipelines, and from pipelines later maybe energy, nuclear energy. We have seen those projects in Belarus recently. We see how Russia fought actually and was interested to develop nuclear projects in Hungary. But I think the real resources is now somewhere else. Russia has transformed itself in this influence on the banking sector. And the influence in the bank sector, especially in Central Eastern Europe, is as one of the key assets for this country to shape and to use means of pressure that are aligned, that are serving its foreign policy goals. So all in all, regardless of depletion of a certain model of energy, fossil fuel based, or gradual decline of it, Russia is also looking at those and it's transferring its assets elsewhere, including hydrogen power also. You know, one of the big discussions I understand in Brussels these days is, you know, whether we go from gas to blue energy being burning hydrogen. And how do you transport hydrogen? The idea is you transport it through pipelines. Well, where does it leave Russia? Russia controls a lot of pipeline system, and it will feel powerful still when it comes to such means of energy production.
Thank you, Wojciech. Does anybody want to ask a question now? Well, I would ask maybe, I would ask about Hungary's attitude as the editor of this Visegrad Insight. I'm sure you know quite a lot about it. So the attitude towards the Western Balkans, Hungary is very much in favor of EU integration of Serbia, particularly, if I'm right. And is it connected somehow to the substantial Hungarian minority? And at the same time, we see that in Ukraine, in this case, there's also a Hungarian minority, but the Hungarians are much more careful and even have more or less confidential approach to Ukraine or to certain policies, language or educational policy of the Ukrainian government. So is it because of the general carefulness towards Russia that Hungary has been showing in the recent years?
I couldn't hear all of what you said, so I'll try to paraphrase what I heard.
So shall I repeat maybe?
No, I think I got the essence, but correct me if I'm wrong here. I understand that you're asking what sort of connection of Hungary has to Serbia and to Western Balkans altogether, and how, in the light of also Hungarian minority in the Western Balkans, but not only, are Hungarian shaping their vision of Ukraine, and therefore how it might be impactful on the Eastern Partnership, right? That's as much as I understood. And so the answer is simply Hungary is looking very much to the Western Balkans, its immediate neighborhood. It has been investing in it not only politically but money-wise, purchasing media, purchasing assets that help them fulfill some sort of a promise of integration with those countries, much more politically ahead of EU even. You see personal connections developing between Mr. Orban and several of the leaders in the immediate neighborhood of the countries that are not part of EU, early in advance, showing how to benefit and what is the know-how of getting into EU and doing things the way Budapest wants. And this quid pro quo comes with the influence Budapest wants to have on those countries. So essentially, ambitions of Budapest are to grow its influence, regional influence, on indeed territories that were formerly Hungarian, but I wouldn't say this is predominant. They want to use the proximity, the cultural and historical proximity, more of a tool of doing business with the countries there. And the other objective there, I think, especially pressing on for Serbian integration, is by means of enlargement, of a future enlargement, to secure that countries more like us, more like Budapest, not to say more like me and you or Poland, are accepted, meaning that countries which have some issues with the rule of law, which do not apply the standards that we call Maastricht Treaty overall, and including the conditionality and the rule of law are not there, so that other allies of such a mindset are in the same club, in the same format of Eastern part of the European Union. When it comes to Ukraine, it's completely different. Hungary doesn't see itself in such a close relationship to Ukraine. There are two aspects. One is indeed the Hungarian government, before Mr. Orban, has been taking care of the Hungarian minority in the small strip of land in the west of Ukraine, because in Zakarpatski region, mostly because when it comes to human rights of this population, that includes access to their education in the language of their origin, taking care of the heritage of the cultural heritage that is there, both material and immaterial. There wasn't much investment from Kiev. It was underinvested, and Hungary has invested a lot in that. So it has to be recognized as a way Hungary is taking care of Hungarian minority groups all around. This is the 100 years anniversary of Trianon, after which Hungary has had embraced and has been doing a lot for Hungarians abroad. After the territory of the country has been cut to 1/3 of what it was. But in terms of policy on Ukraine and relationship to NATO and EU, Hungary has proven to be a blocker without a clear understanding what it wants to achieve. So if there was a willingness to compromise, the compromise could have been struck much earlier. This was on the language law, for instance, which was the trigger for the current standoff between two countries. And the example of this problem being resolved was a relationship between Poland and Ukraine. Initially, hard and harsh remarks led to a compromise between Polish government and Ukrainian government on how to protect Polish minority rights, cultural rights in Hungary. Obviously doesn't want to do that, and it's being pressured also from Poland on the question of Ukraine through parliamentary assemblies of NATO and in other formats, because of this, because this is conflicting when it comes to objectives or foreign policy interests.
Thank you very much. Questions, anyone?
Hello. Yes.
Yes, please, Valentina.
Hi. Can you hear me? This is Valentina, a researcher from Armenia. Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers for this event. I want to follow up on what you said related to the Poland and Hungary being, so to speak, the least trusted countries in the EU today, and in regarding the advocacy within the European Union. But in that scope, if I may ask you to orient or transfer the discussion towards more domestic issues of Poland, and in particular, I'm interested, can you please elaborate on the current situation in Poland regarding the policy environment for civil society in the context of recent developments in Poland and the rising populism and also authoritarian practices? Within that framework, what is the current policy or environment and the strategies of the government towards the civil society activity and organizations? The question comes also from the information that in the region we spoke about the Ukraine and also very, very dangerous developments related particularly to the restricting the activity and the operation of civil society organizations. So I wonder what is the current, if this is a relevant question for you concerning your expertise, but that will be really interesting to learn. the developments, the Poland as an EU representative country, but also with the legacy and problematic recent developments regarding democracy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Valentina. So, yeah, it's a bit of a question. I wasn't initially prepared to answer in this session, but actually we have developed a report on scenarios for civil society in Central Europe that might answer a lot of your questions, and let me just share it also. Yeah,
thank you. That will be great. Mm-hmm.
So this is here in the chat. You can click on it. This report also relies on trends and reports and articles we have been collecting, analysis and also opinion, plus our some of our research work and interviews we conducted with civil society representatives in the region. So you can find a lot of answers there. But when it comes to Poland specifically, I think on the policy level there isn't anything that you would say that is curbing civil society right to conduct activities. But when it comes to issues related to politics or politics or policy sensitive issues, when it comes to protests, when it comes to freedom of speech, when it comes to rights to demonstrate freely, that, although not targeted specifically on civil society organizations, but civil society or society overall, freedoms of individuals, there were policies that are very negative, and COVID-19 only sped them up, and then they became more apparent in limiting the rights to protests and limiting the access to information, access to the public institutions, even not only for civil society, journalists included. This was implemented. This is being seen currently, but at the same time, in contrast to that, you see the vibrant civil society on the streets and in activities all around the country. So the situation seems to be like a challenge, like a gauntlet from the government that is less powerful in implementing its vision of the society, and it's sort of a revolution, you would say, they want to have with the exchange of the leads, then the power of the civil society that remains stronger and vibrant and escapes this sort of challenges. So people do protest, people are challenging the government policies, and so far the society has been vibrant. But as everything, it all depends on timing. And the more time such regulations, rules are in place, the more risk there is that they will be actually sedimenting in the political and general culture of the country.
Yes, more questions, please. Well, I actually have a question which, because of the COVID pandemic, in some countries, there may be concerns about the possibility of a new authoritarian upsurge, even in the EU. In Hungary's case, if I'm not mistaken, Peter Greco and some other experts consider that even though the special powers regime has been lifted, the damage has already been made. And certainly some governments in the Eastern Partnership may also find new possibilities of digital surveillance tempting, or otherwise get involved in more practices resembling big data authoritarianism. So how do you see these trends in Eastern Partnership and also within the EU?
COVID-19?
So the pandemic-related new authoritarian tendencies in some countries, in Eastern Partnership or in the EU, how do you see that?
Yeah, we have seen that in Belarus, for instance, where Mr. Lukashenko first disregarded the threats, and then he started to implement laws that basically are new censorship related to spreading potential of being jailed for disseminating any information that is not in accordance with what the government is saying. So that's one thing. The other thing, and that's all across the world, that the effect of the pandemic will be on economy, distribution of resources. The governments will have much more to say when it comes to the distribution of funding. This will centralize governments, this is centralizing governments, and this is limiting economic space, economic activity, independence, therefore, of the means and the resources. Of course, the governments get money from the economy, from the civil society, but the governments stay and companies go bankrupt. Usually that's how it goes. So the strongest economically more stable and strongest actors are actually the governments. That leads to centralization and difficulties there. I think that is a factor reinforcing overall the situation. But at the same time, I haven't seen so much, because these were two negative ones, but I haven't seen so much protest and so brave and innovative protest and defiance of Lukashenko rules in a decentralized, much proliferated way. Speaking of this particular country example, for perhaps in the whole history of the contemporary Belarus since 1989, you see people really organizing themselves, setting up information networks among themselves because of the health security, but also because mistrust in the government and because of the willingness to do something about it. As I mentioned, and I will point to our scenario number 4, civic emancipation is actually taking place in the times of pandemic the same.
Yes, we saw that in Armenia as well a couple of years ago, and hopefully the civil societies in our countries will stay strong and active and can keep pushing the governments towards some improvement and developments. Investment into the future, and I'll ask questions or share some thoughts.
I have a request. If you hear me, because I do not hear you now, could you just type it? Just where?
Yeah, I can hear you very well, but there is something with my microphone, perhaps. But, so, does anybody have any more questions or comments? Please feel free to share your thoughts. We want to know some more opinions, certainly. We don't see any.
Armen, I don't know if this is my video or yours, but okay, I see Armen has left. I don't know if there are any other questions. I think time is also up.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for the disruption. There was some issue with the connection, probably. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Armen. Yeah.
Yes. So, what are the opinions in the EU about this possibility of bridging between the EU and the Eurasian Union via some of the Eastern Partnership countries? This is it was a popular topic in Armenia, although now it's becoming less and less feasible because the idea that some investors could be interested in investing in Armenia in order to export to Russia is becoming even weaker because of the oil price and less and less possibility for the Russians to spend as they used to. But what is the attitude in the EU towards this idea?
Which idea?
So bridging with the Eurasian Union via some of the Eastern Partnership countries.
No, I know this is specifically interesting for Armenia, but I don't hear much of that. There isn't even much of a recognition of this Euro-Asiatic Union. It's not, it's Russia. That's it.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, without having an official framework like that, Belarus has been re-exporting, and because of the restrictions that Russia imposed on its own imports. But otherwise, I don't know, except the Moldovan President Dodon, hardly any of the Eastern Partnership leaders might want something like that. And his position is becoming, I guess, less and less stable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there is any appetite for a real reapproachment with the Euro-Asiatic group. But if there is, it is direct contact. We don't need proxies. When it comes to money flow, basically Belarus was repackaging or basically falsifying the origin of products, and this was enabling exchange of those products. But this was also, it had its limitation, and the limitations are quite severe now. It was mostly, products like Polish apples or pork that was entering Russian market through Belarus as Belarusian production. That's not related to EU policy overall. It was individual business.
And I remember a publication by Lord Delcourt, Hrant Kostanyan and others about 5 years ago that there are several issues, including that the EU cannot formally recognize the Eurasian Union because also geopolitical implications, because such recognition could be perceived as a signal that the increasing bipolarization of Europe is accepted. So it would be like accepting the logic of bloc-to-bloc negotiations. Do you think this argument still is valid?
Perhaps, yes, and perhaps in the sense of this international order and whether you want to recognize such a new conglomerate. But again, I mean, why? I don't see a reason why to build any sort of a relationship with the organism or this Euro-Asiatic Commission or mission, the Union, if the member states are not interested in it so much. I mean, they were forced to participate in a way, but they first and foremost do not want to cooperate on, because it's just a form of legitimizing resources as extraction from those countries and benefiting Moscow.
Thank you. Any more questions from the participants? Yes, Nerses, please.
Hello. I have a question regarding the situation in Armenia. Here we have a lot of pro-Russian parties, which doesn't actually have a natural popular support. They buy this support by fueling money into some pro-Russian organizations directly, or they do that using by supporting mass media with pro-Russian sentiments, etc. So if they didn't have that amount of money they currently have, the influence wouldn't be such big in Armenia. So the question is it possible that the EU will impose some sanctions or some punishment actions on the, for example, extracting sector, mining sector in Armenia, from where I believe mainly they are getting a lot of unaccounted money, and they use to fuel these policies.
Well, I haven't heard of such one, but that doesn't mean that someone is not looking into this now. Yeah. So
well, I guess there are issues that we can and we should solve internally, and it's been maybe a bit too slow, but with the recent law about illegally acquired assets and some other additional legal frameworks, some issue may be solved gradually. But yes, of course, this information, or rather disinformation campaign, and the ongoing attack on the democratic governments, on civil society from the, perhaps, let's say, so-called opposition and their enablers, on the country's sovereignty. After all, this attack has been going on, and now there are issues to solve, but there are still some domestic instruments that can be effective in this regard. Any more questions? There is some high sound disrupting. Okay, so and I'll ask you to maybe wrap up, Wojciech, if you want, if there are no more questions or comments.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I see and I'm observing Armenia, maybe not the closest country for me in what I do, but I'm very happy to nurture our friendship, our relationship, and with other partners in Armenia. The country in itself definitely deserves better, and I think you're doing well on that path. And I think we need to strategize and think through the futures. This is the purpose. This is the purpose of the exercise we conducted. And hopefully, even thinking the negative possibilities, we should never lose hope. It's for better outcomes. It's this short phrasal even that we need to hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's how it goes. And I hope we contributed today a bit to that thinking.
So thank you, Wojciech, and I would like to thank all the participants for joining us today. And I suggest you follow our webpage and also on Facebook. We will soon post the date of the meeting with the online meeting with a Czech expert, and for an online event with Alexander Duleba from the Slovak Foreign Policy Association. We already have the date and time fixed. So, sorry, the 17th of July at 11 a.m. in Yerevan, and you are very welcome to join. So please follow us and also follow Visegrad Insight. And if you want to be informed about the Eastern Partnership and the EU, I strongly suggest doing so. Thank you and have a nice day. And I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Armin.